Hey everyone, welcome to Office Hours. I'll let everyone sign on our weekly conversation. It's nice to talk to all of you. Today, of course, is Martin Luther King Day, so an important day to commemorate one of the most central civil rights leaders. And had a request to talk about Rabbi Prince. So let me try to get to that at the beginning and just the role of many religious leaders in the civil rights movement of the era is actually quite interesting. So for everyone joining who is new, I'll take questions on whatever topics are on your mind. Just put them in the chat and I'll try to answer them or comment on them. Tomorrow, the Long View will drop a new newsletter looking back at the last year of the Trump presidency. Thank you for that question. And I'm going to start up my foreign policy column. My vacation from that is over. I think the first one will come out next week, and tomorrow I will do in the classroom. And Lynn, I'm not. I tend to constantly be thinking and doing things. So semester actually starts next week, but I'm always at work in one way or another. And later this week, Jonathan Cohn will be joining me from the Bulwark. Many of you enjoy our conversations. Jonathan Alter and I will be having then and now. And I think I'm going to try to line up one more guest for Friday and all the regular newsletters. Some of you have been enjoying the interviews I'm conducting with historians who came of age in the 70s and 80s. And I'm really glad that you are. And I'm trying to build an archive. I think it was a really important generation of writers, often these days, who are in some ways under attack, even though it's not them specifically. It's for the kind of work they did and the way they changed how we think of American history and brought in the kinds of questions in American history. So it's really, really nice to be building an archive and sharing that with the paid subscribers to the Long View. And I'm glad you've been enjoying them. I have a lot of really fantastic historians upcoming, including one of the greatest, Eric Foner, the historian of Reconstruction, who did a really thoughtful interview with me. Many of you know his work. He writes as a public intellectual for The Nation, New York Times, and more. And I think you'll really learn a lot. So a couple issues. First, someone asked me about Rabbi Prince, who was a rabbi who speaks at the March on Washington. He actually helps to organize some of the March on Washington, and he was a rabbi who was part of a cohort at the time. Both of rabbis from the Jewish community, but religious leaders more broadly, who were in different ways involved in civil rights activism. For Rabbi Prince, there was a kind of natural connection between Jewish theology and traditions of Jewish thought and ritual that often revolve around the Exodus and escaping captivity that naturally aligned them with what civil rights activists were talking and talking about civil rights in religious and theological kind of tropes and rhetoric was familiar, obviously, to many of the top civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King, who formed alliances with Rabbi Prince and others, such as Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was another rabbi at that time, a theologian who becomes involved. He marches in Selma, one of the Selma marches in 1965. Heschel's involved in civil rights activism in New York. Rabbi Prince was deeply involved. I'd say of all the rabbis, he was one of the most kind of organizationally intertwined in what the movement was doing. There were also many religious leaders of different Christian denominations who become involved, including in places like the Midwest. All of this is to say, as an answer to why that was so important. And having Rabbi Prince there at the March on Washington in August of 1963 is that alliance really, I think, helped to broaden civil rights, which in 63 was still a very radical cause, certainly in the South, but even in other parts of America. I think we forget that. I think often Martin Luther King on this day is treated as kind of inevitably mainstream, but many in mainstream America at that point still had not accepted him or a lot of what he was fighting. So to have religious leaders like Rabbi Prince become involved in the movement as really an interfaith coalition supporting and demanding not just the concept of civil rights, but at the March on Washington, Prince and others are really calling for what becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1963 was integral to broadening political support and giving the movement a kind of moral weight that for many Americans it still did not have. So thank you for bringing up, and perhaps I can use in the classroom where I have more time just to talk about him and some of the leaders in certainly the Jewish community, but in the religious community generally. In my book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, I talk about some of this because in the Midwest, where Republicans were often in power, and Republicans in 64 were essential to ending the civil rights filibuster, which was being conducted by Southerners. Civil rights activists depended on religious leaders to really build support for the legislation and the movement. Preachers in the Midwest in states like Illinois, which was the home to the Senate minority Republican leader Everett Dirksen, would give sermons calling for an end to the filibuster and allowing the Senate to vote. They would lobby members of Congress who were much more conservative but listened to preachers in a way they didn't often listen to civil rights activists. And certainly the Jewish community was deeply involved, Prince and others, Heschel, in doing similar kinds of work in their communities as well. So it's a fascinating part. It became a big part of my book, The Fierce Urgency of Now. I also wrote a biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel, which tries to contextualize him in these political movements of the 1960s. Bonnie asked what can be done to control the president. And I think, look, historically, we're looking in some ways at a pessimistic answer. If this is an issue that is of concern to you, in other ways, there are answers. The pessimistic answer is it's very hard to restrain executive power. And this is not simply a product of the Trump presidency. It's a product of the presidency really since the early 20th century, a gradual aggrandizement of executive power with moments such as the 1970s, where Congress tries to take back some of that power. Since 9/11, we have been back on a path where you've had very expansive executive power. And of course, it's notable that ICE comes out of the Department of Homeland Security and the post 9/11 program just to show how these trajectories work. There's deep historical roots in what he is tapping into. None of that is to say that what you see from President Trump is not exceptional. It's not abnormal, but it does build on this foundation of executive power, which many people, Democrats and Republicans, have warned unsuccessfully is a dangerous kind of situation to create because you're counting on the good use and good graces of the person given that power, as opposed to the kind of structure that is rooted in our Constitution, where it doesn't matter who is in power, you create a system that automatically checks it. So that gets to, Bonnie, part two of your question, what can be done? And we've talked here on the Long View before. One of the biggest answers is right in front of the nation, and that is Congress. While Congress is inactive, while the Republican majority right now has very little appetite to do anything, although there's been a little bit of rumbling on some issues like the ACA benefits, the War Powers Resolution 4 a day, the Epstein files. Generally, the Republican majority sees it as in their interest to support the president, to support the president's use of power. And that's where the first answer is. If a few Republicans acted differently, we're not talking about all Republicans, that would create a bipartisan coalition where there are lots of checks. You can check a president through oversight and creating political kind of fallout. Two, you can have budgetary power become a source of curtailing what the executive branch has at their disposal. Three, obviously, if the Senate was acting either with some Republicans bolting or under Democrats, they could block a lot of what the administration wants to do, not just with legislation, but with judicial appointments. Obviously, there's the biggest power, which, though has been ineffective, impeachment is still there. So Congress has lots of powers. And Bonnie, that's really the answer I always give. The question is not, is there anything to do? It's, will Congress use the powers they have? And this is, again, it feels very urgent now, but it is a historic kind of tension we have seen play out many times, again, including in the 1970s, where you have a moment where Congress actually does respond through many kinds of reforms, legislations, and oversight, and demonstrates. Two, you have the courts. I think many people have been disappointed in terms of the Supreme Court as a source of restraint. Federal district judges, though, have been a very different story. And they have played a pretty strong role, I would argue, in year one, even if some of their rulings are ultimately overturned, some have not been. And they have certainly slowed down the administration. They've often tied up the administration. But the more courts can do, and ultimately it will come down to a reckoning for the Supreme Court of where they stand on these kinds of questions that become much more apparent when you're dealing with real world situations like Renee Nicole Good and her tragic death. And so the courts are a second. And third, it's what you're seeing, and it's the hardest in some ways of all. It's citizen action. And historically, this has been really something that can push back against presidents who feel the political winds when they are blowing on the streets. There's, again, I'm tapping into that same era, but the record and the archives make clear that Presidents Johnson, President Nixon were both very aware of the protests as they grew in 67 to 69, and then kind of a resurgence after Kent State in Cambodia in 1970 and 71, very aware of that pressure. Nixon takes many moves. Some are just to secretly conduct the war, but others are to end the draft. Others are Vietnamization, which is a pullback of U.S. troops. And part of what we've learned is he's worried about the political fallout. Citizen action can involve political action. Again, there's great studies about what happened in 2018. It's not simply a natural backlash in those midterms toward the Trump administration. It was the hard work in large part of suburban educated women who from 2016, the day after the election, were registering, canvassing, working on local candidates, and working to make sure that those midterms were successful. Citizen action obviously can entail good old fashioned texting, calling, emailing representatives, meeting with them, going to district rallies and holding up signs if ICE is the issue on your mind about that. So citizens are kind of a third realm historically that have been very instrumental to restraining a president. All of those are still on the table. All of those are very important. Obviously, we're now in 2026. It's a midterm year, and some of this story will revolve and unfold around the balance of power, around both the way in which the midterms are conducted, which I know is a big issue for many people right now, making sure they are conducted well and they're not stopped and there's no intimidation, which is a fear with these ICE troops in the streets. And B, that the outcome creates some balance. It will not be complete, but a minimum, a Democratic House would make a big difference in terms of that. So I think those are the three areas where we are really looking. I guess the fourth would be the media. All moments when excessive executive power becomes an issue, whether it was conservatives. Oh, Kat, thank you. Just our timing is perfect on that. Whether it was more conservative voices attacking Franklin Roosevelt in 1937 and 38 over his proposal to expand the court, whether it was the Woodward and Bernstein generation of journalists in the 70s, and they were two among many who really had been looking deeply, both with Johnson and Nixon, about how presidential power was abused, to the post 9/11 period when I think journalism played a big role. I've talked here in the Longview. I talked to my students about 60 Minutes then, with the coverage of Abu Ghraib and the way they exposed a U.S. policy of torture in the wake of 9/11, which was extraordinarily damaging politically as people learned about that, and ultimately would create the conditions for President Obama to move back against a lot of that. Although, as Karen Greenberg, who joined us on Friday, said, now we're seeing a return to some of that. But journalists were quite important. And there's a lot of concern right now. I mean, all the four areas I just mentioned to all your questions. Will Congress do something? The Republican majority, will they do something? Yes or no? Will the courts continue to fight back? And how will the Supreme Court react? Will citizen action be sustained as we saw in the civil rights era as we speak on Martin Luther King Day, or will it be too sporadic and limited? And finally, the media, there's great concern because of how a lot of mainstream outlets are under intense pressure or direct pressure. We're seeing this at CBS to avoid critical commentary on the administration. So those are the four areas that are important. All four areas, I think, have reasonable questions. Right. And we will see. Lynn raises a very important point that I teach about a lot, um, about journalism, how fragmented it is today. So in the 70s, this is where I teach a course at Princeton on the U.S. since 1974. So I start in the 70s, and one theme we discuss is just that. Um, and Brian, I will get to that in a second. So the media then, there was a kind of much more stable and centralized system. You had, three major networks: ABC, CBS, NBC. You had a handful of major city papers like the Times or the LA Times or the Baltimore Sun or the Post that really dictated a lot of the conversation. And you had very tight editorial standards, not perfect, but tight, and limits on getting information out. You had to go through those gatekeepers, so to speak. That all changed. It changed with cable, for example, that created a 24-hour news cycle that created commercial news networks rather than networks carrying news as a public service, became more fragmented. You had just many more different kinds of options, and you had non-news options, which allowed more citizens just to opt out of major events. You have partisan news really taking hold in the early 2000s as a kind of normative form of journalism. And finally, social media creates what I call a filterless system where information disseminates without any of the old kind of editorial controls that were so important back in the 70s. So I think, Don, you're exactly right. Again, the challenges doesn't mean, in my opinion, that news inevitably won't be out there, that it can't be done well. I think independent journalism is doing a pretty good job. I think not all of it, but a lot of it's doing really good work on this front. But those are challenges that make the structure of the 70s very different than today. You can't simply resurrect a Woodward and Bernstein kind of, duo and moment. You have to do it within the context. And Don, you're right. The local newspapers is yet another area. We have fewer of them, far fewer of them. So there's less local news. Uh, and um, and I think there's also, some argue, less trust in news because that's often what people really connect to the most. The Insurrection Act, Brian, is on many people's minds. I think there's not a low probability at this point. President Trump has openly talked about invoking it, and that's pretty broad authority. I mean, it allows the president to use federal troops here domestically, which it was a series of acts actually created in the 19th century without the limitations that we have on doing that. The presidents have been very reluctant to do this. There's only a few cases. A lot of them are from the 1870s. We've talked here about how President George H.W. Bush used this with the riots in LA, where both the mayor and the governor called on the president to use it. But now President Trump is threatening to use it, even though state and local authorities are actually working to achieve calm rather than the opposite. And there's questions, Brian, about how could it be challenged. Even when the Insurrection Act has been used, it's been targeted, very specific. It's not what President Trump seems to envision. So clearly, I think there would instantly be constitutional challenges. But I must say, just to step back, this is an area where there have been voices over and over who have said that this is a kind of presidential authority that has to be more contained. And over the decades pre-Trump, and certainly in between the two terms, there have been voices saying you need to specify when a president could have this power, what an insurrection is, what constitutes that kind of emergency. It's like emergency powers. Otherwise, it's a blank check. And this is through legislation. So here Congress has consciously, deliberately given the president this kind of power, and the nation has depended on a president resisting it, even back in 1964 and 65, when you had cases that I think more people found understandable of why a president was thinking of using federal troops. There you had in the South, state and local authorities explicitly not only not implementing the law, but even worse, in cahoots with the forces that were violating the law, violating the 14th Amendment, violating the 15th Amendment. You had in Mississippi, for example, local sheriffs were in the KKK and working with the KKK all the way through the state government. And yet there are memos from DOJ really warning presidents against doing this. Presidents Johnson and Kennedy were very reluctant to get involved when they did, such as in Mississippi in 1962 for the desegregation of the school. It's with incredible hesitation, and that got them criticism. But in this case, there's much less, I think, kind of support. And it's, again, this is what happens when you have such a grant of executive power. And that's why when Democrats were in control, just Dave, there were arguments that you had to do exactly what you were saying, that you had to take these windows when a president wasn't really interested in deploying it to create limits. It doesn't mean you do away with any ability of a president to deploy troops. There are places and times you could imagine that's necessary, but you have to limit it. You have to create that constitutional founding fathers vision where I think Madison was onto something, where the checks of the system are in place and stronger than the dependence on the good conscience of those in power. Otherwise, you always make yourself vulnerable to dangerous situations. Let me take our break and thank all the subscribers who are watching right now, everyone who is joining with these wonderful questions. And please send a few more and comments, which really are the heart of this. Paid subscribers, thank you for allowing the long view to continue. I feel more energized than ever. I know there's this conversation of people who feel somewhat worn out or dejected. I feel the opposite. I feel this is the time to engage, it's the time to have serious conversations and try to raise the level right now. Because the times are so serious. So paid subscribers, thank you for allowing this platform to happen. Independent journalism depends on paid subscribers. And if some of you are able to change that a subscription to a paid subscription, I would really appreciate it so I can keep bringing you all these great voices and keep writing all the things that I am trying to do. Don, we shall overcome. That brings me back. Some of you know the story, and Don, you might. One of the most kind of poignant moments in that mid 1960s was in March of 1965. And what happens is when here's a little civil rights history is when the year started. Civil rights activists, not just King, but kind of the broad coalition, was voting rights. The Civil Rights Act of '64, which ended legal segregation, passed. Civil rights activists wanted to move quickly and right away to voting rights, which had been left out of the legislation for many reasons. And Johnson actually um, wants to delay the voting rights because he wants to get onto other issues, Medicare and education. And he's worried voting rights would quickly tie up Congress. But the movement forces his hand, and there's the famous march, the first march in Selma, which ends in terrible violence on the Pettus Bridge. John Lewis is one of the people hurt. But Johnson shifts very quickly and gives a speech to Congress calling on Congress to pass a voting rights bill. And the moment, Don, that I'm referring to, and yes, Brian, it's another example where racial violence and violence by police authorities was front and center. He gives a speech calling for civil rights. And in that speech, the key moment is he says, "And we shall overcome." And for many people, if you hear that today, it doesn't seem kind of like the key moment. They wouldn't totally grasp it. But at that time, for the president of the United States to use the part, the song and that line that was literally chanted at most civil rights activities and rallies and protests, even in the jail cells where activists had been arrested. "We shall overcome" was a dramatic moment where the president embraced the movements that were calling for social justice and that were calling for progressive reform, and kind of took that as one of his own. Lynn, that's a great suggestion, and thank you. We will talk about all these issues and just note them yourselves. And as we had with Rabbi Prince and religious leaders, please just bring it back right at the beginning of office hours. Always a perfect way to discussion. Kat, finally, look, I don't know. The question of is the threat of the Insurrection Act, is the presence of federal, um, you know, troops, whatever you want to call ICE in the streets, prelude to at least intimidation in the midterms? Look, my answer is A, I don't know. And I'm always cautious. I don't know kind of the thinking of the administration. B, the idea that if that continues through midterms, you would have an intimidating force in midterms, even if midterms are being conducted regularly in a state like Minneapolis, I think is hard to deny. Right now, schools in Minneapolis, I just heard a lot of them are virtual for a while because people are scared and they don't want to bring their kids out in this environment. So, of course, this is going on in November. It will be an issue regardless of what we know the administration's intent. And so I think that is important. Third, I keep coming back to January 6th. It is not irrational or hysterical to say that there should be concern that midterms are conducted smoothly, and there's already been efforts by the administration to take steps that would make the voting harder and raise questions about the operations. And so I think this is a midterm year where the outcome isn't the only issue. The process itself, people have to be vigilant. Elected officials at the state and local level who control elections, according to the Constitution, must be on top of this. And above all, we must make sure that the very right that Martin Luther King Jr. sacrificed his life for, the right for full citizenship, which includes the right to vote, is respected, is honored, and is allowed to be expressed come November. So I think it is actually a fitting thought to end our conversation today on Martin Luther King Day. Don't worry, next week we'll have plenty of time to talk a lot of these other issues. And of course, you can continue in the chat for the long view. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and have a good day. Have a good week. Let's all take a moment to think about the work that Martin Luther King and so many other civil rights leaders did for the country on this day of commemoration. We'll talk soon.